The guards burst into the cellar so abruptly that everyone who heard them recoiled. Commands were shouted, footsteps thundered on the stone floor, and in the flickering light of the torches, she suddenly appeared. The Duchess. She stood by the iron bars of the cell and held a rag in her hands, stained with blood. Behind the bars sat he, young, broad-shouldered, with a torn shirt and shackles on his wrists. He raised his head and met her gaze. There was no embarrassment in his eyes, only a direct, cold question. "Have you come to watch?" "Stop!" shouted the senior guard. "Her ladyship should not be here. This is a prison cell." He stepped back, but did not leave. The Duchess did not respond to the formalities. She stepped closer, knelt down, and placed the rag on the floor, without taking her eyes off him. "What is your name?" she asked curtly. "Boris," he replied. His voice was steady, without tremor. "Son of Marquis Redmond." "Do you know who I am?" she asked. "I know," he said. "You are Duchess Elena. You sit on the throne now. You ordered my father's capture." The Duchess sighed, but did not lower her head. "I did not ask about the reasons," she said. "I asked how you were." He raised his hand, the chain in the shackle creaking. "I am wounded. I do not ask for mercy. I ask only one thing. Stop bringing people terrible news about their families." The guard looked at the Duchess, then at the prisoner. "I will report to the Duke," he said. The Duchess raised her hand sharply, and the guard froze. "Not now," she said. "He remains under my supervision." The guard did not object. He knew her voice, knew her position. They left, slamming the door behind them. The emptiness returned, only the footsteps receded, and in the torchlight, Boris's face was visible, scarred. She took the bowl of soup and handed him a spoon. He ate slowly, cautiously, as if checking to see if the food was poisoned. She sat down next to him and began to rebandage the old bandage on his side. She knew it was a risk, but when her hand touched his skin, he did not pull away. "Why do you come?" he asked after a minute of silence. She put down the cloth and looked at his palms, at the chain that wrapped smoothly around his wrist. "I don't know how else," she said. "I look at people. I see that some live by the old laws and some die, and it hurts me. I came to understand how the one I killed by the will of war lives." He smiled. "Not everything is measured by will," he said. "We make choices, and consequences follow." "I know the consequences," she said. "I knew when I signed the orders. But I didn't know you. You weren't just a name to me." He looked at her longer than necessary. "You can leave," he said softly. "You can forget. People will forget you ever came here." She shook her head. "I don't want to forget," she replied. "I want to remember and try to fix what I can't." That's how their meetings began. She came more often, first with only food and bandages, then with a book, then with simple conversations about the castle's affairs and the home he had lost. She listened. He spoke little, but attentively. He spoke of the battlefield, of night terrors, of how his mother had sewn his coat of arms under his cloak so he wouldn't catch cold. He spoke of his sister, who had been sent to live with an aunt in a distant city, of the house where there had been songs and wine, and now there was silence. "Why don't you ask for mercy?" she asked quietly one day. "Because mercy is a word for the weak," he said. "And because I don't want you to be pitied. I don't want you to be used to show the Duke's mercy. It's better if I remain a shadow." "You speak as if you were already dead," she said. "A dead man is not afraid of chains," he replied. "But I am not dead. I am alive, and I see the faces that stare at me. I hear them discussing my execution." She took his hand. His skin was warm, with a faint tremor remaining. "If I can help, tell me how," she said. He looked at her hand, then into her eyes. "Don't make an enemy of yourself," he said. "If you help me, remember that you are helping a man, not your enemy." She laughed softly. "You sound like a judge," she said. "But if you are accused, it will not only be you who suffers. It will affect me, my family, those who trust me." "Then don't make any mistakes," he said. "But if you do, I won't blame you." In the cell, they did not argue about the truth. They talked about what was in front of them. Their conversations were simple. What they ate, who came to visit, what the Duke said at the council. They exchanged small confidences. He told her about the iron gates at his house. She told him about the room where letters demanding the continuation of the war were kept. Once he said, "I saw you in the field, watching the walls of my house burn." She nodded. "I wasn't looking at your blood," she said. "I was thinking about the people who will die tomorrow." Over time, their meetings became longer. Their touches were accidental at first, adjusting a bandage, removing a crumb of bread, then became deliberate. She touched his cheek when she bandaged his wounds. He held her hand when she cried over a letter demanding the army. They looked at each other, not as judges look at defendants, but as people who know the value of time. The guards rarely noticed the changes. They were used to seeing the Duchess in the morning on the balcony, at court, in councils. They did not think that the same woman could come downstairs and sit by the shackles. But rumors spread quickly, and one day someone asked the senior guard, "Where does Miss Alina go at night?" He shrugged and said he didn't know. He didn't want to ask questions he didn't want to hear the answers to. Weeks passed. Letters from the enemy camp became more frequent. At one of the meetings, news arrived. The enemy army had moved again. They had gathered at the southern border, and their demands were harsh. For the capture of Marquis Redmond, his son, was to be sent to his death to serve as an example. The Duchess overheard the conversation. She brought the letter to the basement and placed it in front of Boris. His face remained unchanged, but his fingers clenched tighter. "They want me to die," he said. "It's their ritual." "They want to show their power," she said. "But She fell silent. Her voice became quiet. "I can't think like the others. I can't look at a person and see only a sign of enmity." He looked at her. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She looked up and stared straight at the cage. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But if they come with a sentence, I won't look at you as a symbol. I'll look at you as a person." She came every day. In the morning, before entering the meeting room, and in the evening, when the lights in the corridor had already gone out. She brought food, bandages, a clean shirt. She sat down next to him, and they talked. The conversations were simple, about letters, about lists of people, about who had gone to serve and who had stayed. Sometimes they were silent and just held each other's hands. It was dangerous, and they both knew it. But neither of them could pretend they didn't want to touch. "Do you think I'm not afraid?" she asked once, when she closed the cell door and stood in the doorway holding a bowl. She looked at him steadily, without trembling. "I know you're afraid," he said. "I'm afraid myself every time I hear footsteps outside the door." "Then why do you come?" she asked. "Because I want to talk," he replied. "Because a woman's voice gives me strength, and because you don't ask why you're helping. You just help." She sat down next to him and put her hand on his shoulder. "I've been thinking about escaping," she said quietly. about opening the gate one night and letting you go. But I imagine what they would say afterwards. The Duchess betrayed her home. They would take away my title, take away everything. They could kill me even more slowly than they killed you. I thought, that's the price. I'm willing to pay it. But then I think of the children, of the people who believe in me, and I put it off. He looked at the floor. If you let me go, I'll leave. I won't come back. I don't want anyone to die for me. But if you don't let me go, I'll die as a symbol. I don't want to be a symbol. She took a deep breath and smiled quietly. You always speak with the words of a great man. You end with the words duty and honor, as if they are the answers to all questions. I don't want you to live by those words for my sake if you don't want to. I want to live, he said bluntly. I want to live not for honor, but so that one day I can wake up and see that I have a place to return to. I want to see your face, not through bars. She pressed her palms to her lips and closed her eyes. I want that too, she said softly. They began to prepare, not rushing into madness, but preparing practically. She wrote down a plan with the help of an old servant, one who could be trusted. His name was Marco. He was old and quiet, and had served her father and her family for many years. She couldn't trust just anyone. She explained the situation to Marco simply. I want to help the prisoner escape if the worst happens. Will you help me? Marco looked at her for a long time. You know the price, ma'am, he replied. You understand what that means. I understand, she said. I know the price. But if the order comes for his death, I won't be able to sign that document. Marco nodded. I'll help if you give me the order, but you must understand, it will be a risk for all of us. She gave Marco some of the keys to the basement. Those keys were a drop of trust, a sealed hope. He took them without a word and left. At the same time, she began to quietly observe the guards. One of the young ones, named Ralph, began to linger near the basement frequently. He asked questions and looked at her longer than before. She noticed this and began to change the timing of her visits. Once, he stopped her right on the stairs. Where are you going so early, ma'am? He asked calmly. To the letter rooms, she replied. I'm checking the accounts and lists. He looked at her and smiled slightly. You're not visible there at night, he said. I had no right to ask, but I'm curious. Don't ask questions you don't want to know the answers to, she said. Her voice was firm. He backed off, but his eyes remained suspicious. She stepped up her precautions. She made up stories to justify her trips, the need to check supplies, the need to inspect the warehouse. She took Marco with her so she wouldn't have to go alone. Marco knew that keeping his face and not looking at the camera meant survival. There was a growing closeness between her and Boris, but not just physical. They shared their intentions. She learned that he had a brother left in a northern village, that his mother kept a scarf with a patriotic symbol on it, that he had a sword with his initials on it. She told him about the documents, the letters, how the nurse had laughed the night before. They laughed together. He taught her notes that could be useful for an escape, how to walk at night through secondary corridors where the guards' footsteps were muffled, where the old gates still opened. One night, they sat down next to each other on a bench. She took his hand and looked him straight in the eye. If I tell you to run tomorrow night, will you run without me? She asked. I will leave and not return, he said. But I will not abandon you at the first sign of danger. I'm not asking you to stay for my sake, she said. I'm asking you to live. I'm asking you to come back for me someday if you can. "If I can," he replied. "But if you stand on the wall and give my gift to my enemies, I won't be able to forgive you." She smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. She could hear her own heart beating. She wasn't thinking about poetic words. She was thinking about practical things. That he should find a good cloak. That Marco should go to the market and buy bread for the journey. That was their reality. Not words, but actions. The weeks were filled with anxiety. The enemy was approaching slowly but surely. People with bows appeared on the walls. People in the courtyard began to talk about preparing for defense. Rumors spread throughout the city that Marquis Redmond had been killed in captivity and that his son must serve as an example. The Duchess listened to these words and remained silent. Inside, her desire to save him and her fear of the consequences grew stronger. One morning, a letter arrived from the Duke. He was at the border, and he wrote briefly, "Defense. If the prisoner is identified as a threat, decide harshly." She read the letter, hid it in her sleeve, and returned to the basement. Boris was sitting on a bench eating bread. She put her hand on his knee without saying a word. His eyes softened. "Have you decided anything?" he asked. "I have decided one thing," she replied. "If their army comes and demands that I hand you over, I will not do so. I will do everything I can to ensure that you leave alive. But if the day comes when I cannot do that, I will look at you as a person and not at your helmet." He took her hand and squeezed it tightly. "Do what your heart tells you," he said, "but remember, there will be consequences." She looked into his eyes and for the first time said aloud the words they both feared. "I love you." She said it quietly, just so as not to attract the attention of strangers. He froze, then smiled broadly, and in his gaze was what she had previously called the uncertainty of life. "Me too," he said. "I didn't think it was possible. But I love you." They kissed. It was a quick, quiet kiss, without words. They knew their time was short. They knew that each day could be their last. Soon, the first news arrived at the castle. Strange trumpets and drums could be heard in the distance. The rumors became clear. The enemy had moved faster than they had thought. In the evening, the Duchess summoned Marco. They stood in a dark room, and she gave him clear instructions. "Find a cloak, keys, and everything you need. If the order for execution is given, you will lead him to a secret passage under the grain store. There is an exit there that meets an old stone bridge. From there, it goes west." Marco bowed. "I know that passage," he said. "I helped your father open it when I was a child." "Be careful," she said. "If anyone asks, say you were just checking on the grain. Don't mention me." "I won't," he replied. "But if it happens that I can't, you know I trusted you." She nodded. There was a lump in her throat. She went down to the basement, to the cell, and placed a small bundle on the table. "This is for the road," she said, and took out a thin cloak and several gold coins from the bundle. "This is for you." He took the cloak, unfolded it, and looked at the fabric. "You shouldn't have," he began, but stopped. "I know," she said calmly. "But if that day comes, I want you to have a choice." They embraced and remained silent. Outside, the castle was preparing for battle. Inside, they were preparing for human decisions. They both understood that morning would come, and perhaps the end would come too. But they decided to act. They decided to fight for their lives as best they could. Marco arrived that night right on schedule. He walked quietly past the guardhouse, keys in hand, barely breathing. The Duchess stood at the end of the corridor, wearing a dark cloak her face pale. She looked at Marco and nodded. He handed her a small bag with her belongings and nodded towards the basement door. "Is everything ready?" she whispered. "Ready," Marco replied. His voice was calm, but you could hear the fatigue in it. "I checked the passage. No one has been there since the old wars. I removed a few boards. You must know, if anyone hears, it will be a disaster." She nodded and walked over to the cell. Boris was sitting in the corner, his cloak and bag on his knees. He looked up when she entered, his face unchanged as always, unassuming, but intensely focused. "Do you think it will work?" he asked quietly. "I think it's a chance," she said. "I can't promise it's safe, but a chance is better than standing here and waiting." He stood up. The chain creaked, and Marco looked away guiltily. The Duchess took out the key and quickly inserted it into the lock. The door opened. He pulled out the shackles. Boris could barely stand on his feet. He looked at her and said, "You understand that if I leave, you could lose everything?" "I already lost everything when I saw you behind bars," she replied calmly. "My decision is my choice." He carefully put on his cloak, took his bag, and they set off. Marco held the torch ahead of them as they walked down the old steps to the tunnel, where people rarely ventured. The Duchess walked beside him, her hand trembling, but she did not let go of his fingers. He stared at the wall, as if looking for direction, and it did not look like weakness, but like a man concentrating. When they came out into the corridor under the warehouse, the air was stuffy. People were whispering. At the exit, Marco stopped and whispered, "The way is clear. Quickly. If anything goes wrong, run west and hide at the old mill. They'll help you there." Boris looked at the Duchess. "Are you coming with me?" he asked. She looked at Marco, then down the tunnel. "I'm not leaving," she said. "But I cannot leave my home without seeing what will become of my people. If I am caught at the gate, I will answer for it. But if you go, and I am not accused of treason, perhaps someone will survive." He squeezed her hand. "I want to live," he said. His voice was simple and honest. "If I survive, I will return." She nodded and slipped out that night as if she were going on her usual rounds. There were several guards in the corridors. They passed without stopping. But Ralph was standing by the stairs. He noticed the Duchess. "Where are you going, Your Grace?" he asked in surprise. She did not stop. "I'm going to the council chamber to check the plans," she said calmly. She knew that lying so close to the truth was risky, but she had no time for explanations. Ralph glanced at Boris. His eyes narrowed. "There you are," he said, and put his hand on the hilt of his sword. She knew that look. It contained not only suspicion, but also the possibility of gain. "That young man is not one of ours, Your Grace." She stopped. "He is wounded," she replied. "He needs help." Ralph approached and looked closely. "You visit him often," he said. "They say you sit with him at night." The Duchess felt tension rise in her chest. She knew that every word could be a trap. "What's in it for you?" she asked quietly. "Nothing," Ralph said. He took a step forward and grabbed her arm. "But if the Duke found out you were hiding an enemy, you'd be in serious trouble." The Duchess's face changed. She pushed Ralph's arm away and turned sharply to Boris. "Go," she ordered. "Go, don't stop." He froze. Escape required an instant decision. Boris turned and rushed into the tunnel. Marco stepped after him. Ralph cried out and ran after them. The Duchess stood still. Ralph grabbed her by the shoulder and pulled her back. "You're trying to help the enemy," he said. There was no hesitation in his voice. If this is confirmed, I will report it personally. She pulled her arm away. If you're trying to threaten me, she said quietly, think of your wife and children, Ralph. They depend on your decision. Don't do anything foolish. He blinked, looked at her face, and perhaps at her title. But in the next moment, footsteps were heard behind them. Someone was calling from above. A candle lit up on the wall, and more people appeared on the stairs. They were not accompanied by the Duke, but by the captain of the guard, a tall, stern man. "What is going on here?" he asked. Ralph pointed towards the tunnel. "She let the prisoner go," he said quickly. "I saw him run away." The captain turned his head towards the Duchess and asked sternly, "Is that true?" She did not lie. Lying at that moment would only have increased suspicion. "I gave him a chance to leave," she said bluntly. "I do not agree with destroying a man to set an example." The captain clenched his jaw. "Do you understand that this is treason?" he asked coldly. "I understand," she replied, "but I did what my heart told me to do." The captain looked at Ralph, then at Marco, then back at the Duchess. "You are the decision-maker," he said. "I must report to the Duke." "Do what you must," she said. Her voice was tired, calm, as if she were preparing to accept the outcome. She did not beg or try to persuade. She had already made her decision and knew the price. The captain bound the Duchess's hands. She did not resist. Ralph smiled narrowly, and Marco stood aside, not interfering. "I will conduct an investigation," said the captain. "If it turns out that you helped the escape, you will be brought to justice." "Justice before whom?" she asked. "Before you?" "Before the Duke," he replied. "If the Duke decides to show mercy, there will be mercy. If not, there will be retribution." He led the Duchess to the hall, where the counselors were standing. Rumors spread instantly. Downstairs, Boris ran, Marco followed, and they ran outside through the old passageway. The night was dark, and the sounds of battle were not yet audible. Boris thought only of not stopping. He heard footsteps in the distance but did not turn around. Here and there in the house, cries rose up. He could not listen to them. He ran until a light trail led him to the old road. In the castle, everything was in motion. He was locked in the hall and brought before the council. The Duke entered later, his face scarred with tension. He looked at her as if she had done the impossible. "Do you know what you have done?" he asked quietly. "I know," she replied. "I saved a life." "Whose life is more precious than that of my house?" asked the Duke. "You know that war is no place for pity." "I knew I would have to answer," she admitted, "but I couldn't do otherwise." He looked at her for a long time, then turned away. "Until we know where the prisoner is," he said. "If he returns with the enemy, it will be too late. But if not, there will be punishment." She remained silent. Her hand, which had been chained before, trembled, but her voice remained steady. "I am ready to accept your will," she said. "But I ask you, if you order him to be killed, let it be done quietly. I don't want people to know that I had a hand in it." The Duke looked at her silently and signaled to the guards. They led her out, but said nothing. Stepping into the corridor, she saw Marco standing in the shadows. He nodded to her almost imperceptibly. She understood. He had done everything he could. At night, Boris ran across the fields. He heard voices behind him, but they were far away. He thought about the Duchess. He thought about her face, her hand, how she looked at him before he fled. He thought about what she had given up for him. This gave him the strength to run on. At dawn, he reached an old mill where Marco's men were waiting for him. There he paused for a moment and fell silent. He felt saved, but a feeling of guilt settled in his chest. He was alive, while she was probably still in the Duke's hands. Later, when he learned that the Duchess was being held in the castle and a trial was being prepared, he understood the price he had paid. He realized that her freedom had come at the cost of his escape. He could not undo what had been done. But by then, it was too late. Boris sat by the mill and remained silent for a long time. People came, brought food, gave advice. Some said to go south, others to find a new destiny. He listened, but all he could think about was that the Duchess was in the castle and was responsible for his escape. He couldn't eat in peace. He couldn't sleep. At night, he would get up and walk around the yard, looking at the road she had taken and thinking about her face, about the words she had said before her escape. If I can't do it, let it be done quietly. On the third day after the escape, a man came to the mill from the high hills. He bore the clear mark of the Duke's service, an order on his cloak and a serious face. He approached Boris and said briefly, "They are looking for you. The Duke has declared a state of mourning. The Duchess is accused of treason. The trial is set for tomorrow at dawn. If you do not return and surrender yourself, her execution will take place in public." Boris stopped breathing for a second. Then he asked, "Who told you this?" "I am a messenger from the captain," replied the man. "I am delivering an order. If you want to help, come to the gate and say that you have surrendered. Otherwise, it will be worse." Boris was silent. He understood that if he surrendered, the Duke might demand to know where he had been hiding, and then the people who had helped him, Marco, the miller, would come under suspicion. But if he did not come, the Duchess would pay with her life. He stood up and said, "Tell the captain that I will come to the gate at dawn tomorrow. Tell him that I am coming alone." The messenger looked at him and nodded. Then he left. Boris knew he was walking back into a trap. He knew he might never see the northern river, his home, or his mother again. But he thought of her face and her hand in his. He thought of how she looked at him when she gave him the cloak and coins. He thought that he could not give much in return, but he could give himself. The night before the trial was short. Marco came to him at early dusk. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "I'm not sure of anything," Boris replied, "but I can't live knowing that she is suffering because of me." Marco sighed and put his hand on his shoulder. "If you go, know this. The Duke is not inclined to mercy. He will make an example of you." "Let him make an example of me," said Boris, "but not her." Marco was silent. They walked together to the gate. On the way, Boris thought about how he would stand before the Duke and what he would say. He did not think up any words. He knew one thing: he would take the blame. People were already standing at the gate. The early morning was cold. Guards lined up along the courtyard. People gathered on the stone steps in front of the main hall. The Duke stepped out onto a small platform, flanked by his advisors and the captain of the guard. His face was difficult to read. It showed irritation and fatigue. When Boris stepped out of the crowd and walked towards the gate, the people fell silent. He held his head high. He did not try to run. The guards surrounded him and led him to the craftsman. Marco remained in the crowd, unable to go any further. The Duchess was brought into the hall, bound but restrained. She walked straight ahead without crying out. When Boris saw her, his throat went dry. She looked at him. Their eyes met for a moment. There was no fear in her gaze, only calm determination. He wanted to run up and embrace her, but the guard's hands gripped his elbows. The captain of the guard spoke first. "Duke, he has surrendered. He came voluntarily." The Duke looked at Boris, then at the Duchess. "Did you know he was coming?" he asked sternly. She looked him straight in the eye. "I knew he might return," she replied. "I didn't know he would come himself." "You aided his escape," said the Duke. "You put the house in danger." "I saved a man's life," she said. "I do not believe that the honor of the house is greater than a man's life." The Duke looked around at those present. "This speaks of a threat to the house," he said. "Who else helped? Who else knew?" Boris felt the air tremble around the words. He decided to take control of the situation. "I came," he said loudly. "I came to say that everything she did was her choice. I do not ask for mercy. I only ask that she not pay with my life." A murmur rose in the hall. Some of the Duke's defenders began whispering among themselves. Marco clenched his fist in the crowd but did not move. The Duke looked at Boris and asked, "Are you demanding death for yourself for her sake?" "Yes," Boris replied. "If that is the law, then let it be the law for me." The Duke sat down and looked at the council. One of the advisors, a man with a cold face, said, "If they both live, the enemy will see an example. If we kill the prisoner and leave the Duchess, it will show strength. If we spare them, it will show weakness." "Strength is not measured in a single day," said another. "If she was the reason for the escape, her place is in exile, but even that is risky." The Duke listened. Then he stood up and said, "If he has taken the blame, and if this is confirmed, I will order his death. As for the Duchess, we will restrict her rights and freedoms. Let the people see that I am not broken, but also not cruel without reason. Let her sentence be milder." The Duchess looked at him. "If you order him to be killed, you will cast me aside forever, not only as a ruler, but also as a person who can make choices. I have already paid with my reputation. I beg you, if you make a decision, make it for me." Boris stood up and said, "I am not asking for mercy. Her life is more important to me. Kill me if the house demands it." The Duke sat down and tapped his fingers on the table. He paused. "So be it," he said at last. "Let there be a trial. Tomorrow at dawn, he will be executed. The Duchess will be stripped of some of her powers and sent to a distant relative. So it shall be." His words sounded decisive. The Duchess closed her eyes, then slowly opened them. "If that is the case," she said, "I ask only one thing. Let me see him before he dies." The Duke raised an eyebrow. "A final meeting at the door of the hall," he ordered. "Let there be order." The night in the castle was difficult. Boris thought about what it meant to die. He did not regret his choice. He regretted causing pain to those who had helped him. He thought about Marco, about the miller, about his mother. He thought about the Duchess, who held her head back with dignity, as if she had already accepted the blow. The morning came harsh and clear. A crowd gathered in the square. People whispered, some cried, some discussed how the execution would take place. The Duchess stood in a white shirt, bound, but with her eyes focused on Boris. He stepped towards her, their hands trembling as they touched through the board that separated them. "I didn't want you to pay," she said softly. "I didn't want to live, knowing that you would die because of me," he replied. His voice was steady. "I had to come back." She smiled quietly, and there was something in her gaze that he couldn't describe. "If I had known you would return, I wouldn't have asked you to make that sacrifice, she said. You made your choice. I can't ask for anything else. The crowd fell silent as the captain brought forward the man who was to carry out the sentence. Boris looked at the people. He did not see their faces, but only the fate they determined by their decisions. He was called forward. He stepped onto the platform. The Duchess placed her hand on the board and clenched her fist. "Remember me," she whispered. "I remember," he replied. "I remember you." The execution was quick. Boris looked down, then raised his head. His last words were simple: farewell. They changed nothing. The Duchess listened in silence, while the people whispered and watched. When it was over, the people dispersed. The Duchess was taken back to the hall and prepared for departure. A week later, the court was already going about its duties. The Duchess sat in her rooms, her hands free, but her face pale. She was standing by the window when Marco entered. "I wanted to tell you that we found the letters I asked you to hide carefully," he said. "They confirm that you did not act for the benefit of the enemy." "I knew it would be too late for him," she replied. "I knew my choice would lead to this." Marco lowered his head. "People say different things," he said, "but they also say that you did it out of mercy." She closed her eyes. "Mercy pays for itself," she whispered. "I have paid." Marco sighed and left. She remained alone in the room, thinking about what she had lost and what remained. She thought about home, about how people would look at her. Her title remained, but attitudes had changed. Inside, she felt empty. She understood that she had made a choice that could not be undone. She understood that the love she had found in the basement had left a scar that would never heal. 2 weeks had passed since the trial. In the morning, as the courtyard was waking up, a carriage pulled up to the gate. She was taken away under guard. Marco stood by the stairs and silently took off his hat. The Duchess raised her hand in response and got into the carriage. No one shouted, no one threw stones. People watched and whispered. It seemed to her that she could count every gaze. She looked straight ahead and said nothing. The carriage had a simple bed and a window with bars. She folded her hands on her knees and held the handkerchief that Boris had given her before he fled. It was faded, but now it seemed to her to be the most important thing. Marco gave her a small piece of parchment and whispered, "This is from those who helped. They want you to know. Some are silent, but they remember." She looked at Marco. He looked tired, old. "Thank you," she said quietly. He shook his head and left the carriage, leaving her with her new destiny. She was taken to the house of a distant relative, an old baron who greeted her coldly. He was not a significant figure at court, but he had a house far from the center of power. The house was quiet. She was given a small room on the second floor. The window looked out onto the courtyard, where vegetables were grown, and where people from the street came. Not those who had previously served in the hall, but ordinary workers. Her position with her new master was unenviable. She was allowed to keep her title, but was almost stripped of her power. She could keep a few servants and run the household, but she could not make decisions about war, roads, or debts. Her guard was modest, and not everyone liked her. At first, she received letters from Marco. He wrote that he was still alive, that the people were holding on. But the letters were few and far between. One evening, Marco entered her room. He looked worried. "They found evidence that I was helping," he said. "I had to flee. I thought I could come back, but they were looking for me. I left to protect the mill and the people." She stood up and walked to the window. "Where is Boris?" she asked quietly. "He's gone," Marco replied. You know that? I know, she said, and sat back down. Her hands were shaking, but she tried not to show it. He gave his life. Yes, Marco replied. He sank into a chair. I saw people crying. Some said it was a crazy thing to do, but many also said he was brave. She was silent. Several days passed. She tried to live by the new rules. Get up, eat, receive people who came with requests for help, look at the accounts. But in every document she saw lines that reminded her of shackles. In every face, she saw a share of guilt. One evening, a messenger arrived. He brought a small bundle. Marco opened it and took out a folded piece of cloth. On it were simple letters, the initials that Boris had once carved on the hilt of his sword. Marco put the bundle on the table and said quietly, "He left this for you. I found it at the mill where he was buried. Someone gave it to me and asked me to give it to you." She took the handkerchief and pressed it to her chest. Inside was a short letter. It contained 3 words. Live for us. The letters were uneven but clear. She read it and read it again. The words were simple. She looked at Marco and didn't know what to say to him. He sat down next to her and put his hand on her shoulder. "He wanted you to live," he said. "He was afraid you would die thinking about him." She whispered in response, "How can I live after everything has been taken away? How can I live when every glance is a reproach?" Marco did not answer. The next day, people from the garrison arrived. They reported that the Duke had issued a new order. She was allowed to remain in her position, but she was forbidden to return. Her room was searched, her belongings counted. They left her only a little gold and a few servants. She looked at what was left and felt empty inside. In the evenings, she would go to a small chapel at the end of the estate. It was quiet there. Once, she met an old woman who worked at the house and was called Helga. She brought bread and water, placed it on the table, and sat down next to her. "You don't have to remember everything alone," Helga said. "People often hide their sadness, and then they break down." "It's hard for me to breathe," the Duchess admitted. "I thought I could take the blow, but everything inside me is breaking." "Everyone has their own pain," said Helga. "You did what you thought was right, but people judge according to their fears." The Duchess listened and remained silent. She came to the chapel every day. Sometimes she lit a candle for the souls of those who had died. Sometimes she just sat and folded her hands in silence. She did not ask for forgiveness or demand justification. One thing was important to her: to remember. Months passed. News of the war reached her new home. New people came, old people left. Sometimes the names of people she knew appeared on the lists of victims. She recognized the surnames and remained silent. Her letters from Marco became fewer and fewer. Once he wrote that he had been found and wounded, but he was alive. The last letter was short. "I am alive. Take care of yourself. I can no longer write often." At first, she tried to keep busy. She welcomed people, settled disputes between neighbors, paid for grain. Her hand was steady when she signed documents. But when she returned to her room and closed the door, she sat down and cried. The tears brought no relief, but they allowed her to understand that she was still human. One night, when the snow had already settled on the roofs, Marco came to the house. He stood in the doorway and looked worse than before. It was clear that he had been unable to find peace for a long time. "I found the people who buried Boris," he said. "They told me he was buried quietly as requested. I came to tell you that they haven't forgotten you." She got up and went to the window, where the night lights were reflected in the glass. "I don't want to be a symbol," she said. "I wanted a living person by my side, but I got shackles and emptiness." "Boris wanted you to live," Marco repeated. "He didn't want his death to be an anchor for you. He thought about life." She took the handkerchief, placed it in her palm, and squeezed it until the fabric was crumpled. "Living for others doesn't always mean living honestly," she said. "Sometimes it means living just to avoid feeling empty." Marco didn't know what to say. He stayed and held her hand in silence. Their silence lasted a long time and was full of meaning. Finally, Marco stood up. "I have to go," he said. "My place is not here. I will ask people for work. I will come back if I can." She nodded. When he left, she sat down and stared at the handkerchief for a long time. In it, she could feel the trace of his hands, his scent. It was all that remained. Another year passed. Spring was late. She woke up one morning and realized she could no longer pretend. Every morning was the same. Breakfast, letters, errands, meetings. She slept poorly at night. Her sleep was fitful. She dreamed of faces and footsteps. She began asking Helga to make tea, which reminded her of home. But the taste was empty. That day she wrote 2 letters. One was to the Duke. In it, she asked him to officially cancel part of her punishment and allow her to return if the people would accept her. She knew it was unlikely. The second letter was short and personal. She put it in Boris's handkerchief pocket and sealed it. The letter contained simple words. "I remember. I don't believe in forgiveness. I believe in what was between us." In the evening, she went to the chapel. Helga placed a candle nearby. There she stretched out on the bench and closed her eyes. She remembered Boris's face, his voice. "Live for us." The words sounded, but gave no answer. She took a small flask that she had kept with her for a long time. It contained medicine that a pharmacist had given her for insomnia. She did not think long. She knew that if she left now, no one would blame her for weakness. It would be her choice. She did not seek attention. She did not gather people around her. She placed her handkerchief over her heart, stood up, and walked to the small window. The street lamps were lit, and dogs barked in the distance. She remembered standing at the gate and giving Boris a chance. She thought about how to love means to make choices and choose the price. Then she drank the medicine. It was bitter. She sat down on a bench, put her hand on her heart, and waited. At first, it became difficult to breathe. Then the world narrowed. She thought about Marco, about the people who had helped her, about those who had suffered. She felt sorry for them. She felt sorry for herself. She thought of Boris, and as if in response, heard his calm voice in her memory. "Live for us." She smiled a faint smile, and her eyes closed. The next morning, Helga found her. She called for Marco, but he was already far away. People said that the Duchess had died quietly and without fuss, in a small room far from power. Some said it was weakness. Some said it was courage, to leave, so as not to be a burden. But no one could bring Boris back. No one could bring back what was lost. She was buried not as a duchess, but as a woman who had made her choice. A handkerchief with her initials was placed on her grave. Marco came and placed 2 yellow flowers from the mill there. He did not say much. "He wanted you to live," he repeated quietly. "You left of your own free will." People walked and whispered. Suddenly, someone remembered the day when Boris stood before the crowd and said, "I came for her." This memory haunted them for a long time. People thought about what it means to sacrifice for another and how powerful simple human compassion can be. The castle stood further away. The war did not end immediately. People returned, and life went on as usual. But sometimes, the names of the Duchess and the knight came up in conversation. They talked about goodness and the price one has to pay for making a choice. Some people changed. Some forgot. The story remained in a small chapel, in an old mill, and in a couple of letters kept by Marco and Helga. Those who remembered knew one thing. Love had come to the dungeon and snatched a person from the hands of fate. But the price was high, and both had paid it.